My daughter-in-law walked into my kitchen with her usual bright smile, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee like she was delivering the crown jewels. "I made you something special today, Eleanor," Patricia said, extending one of the cups toward me with that sweet tone that always reminded me of artificial sweetener, cloying and probably bad for you. The coffee smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical. Something. Call it professional instinct or just plain paranoia. But when you've spent 3 decades putting criminals behind bars, you develop a nose for when something's off. When Patricia turned to grab cream from the refrigerator, moving with just a little too much casual deliberation, I quickly switched our cups. Thank God they were identical white mugs, because subtlety has never been my strong suit. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. "There you go," she said, settling across from me with what was now my original cup. "Drink up while it's hot." Her smile was picture perfect, the kind you see in family photos right before someone files for divorce. Michael was reading his newspaper in the living room, just like every Sunday morning for the past 3 months since they'd gotten married. Such a whirlwind romance. 6 months together, married after 3. But then again, when you know you want someone's money, you know, right? I'd tried to be supportive, really I had, but something about Patricia always felt rehearsed, like she was performing the role of devoted daughter-in-law rather than actually being one. We chatted about the weather and Michael's work, while I pretended to sip my coffee and watched Patricia take her first drink. Her face twisted slightly, like she'd tasted something unpleasant, and she set the cup down without taking another sip. Interesting. She said nothing about the taste, which was even more interesting. 20 minutes later, she started coughing. Not the polite little cough of someone clearing their throat, but deep, violent spasms that looked genuinely distressing. "Something's wrong," she gasped, grabbing the table's edge as the coughing grew worse. Her face was flushing red, and I could see panic creeping into her eyes. Real panic, which was curious, considering she'd been the one to brew this particular blend. "Michael!" I called toward the living room, though part of me was genuinely fascinated by this unexpected turn of events. "Michael, come here!" My son rushed into the kitchen, just as Patricia doubled over, struggling to breathe between coughing fits. "Take me to the hospital," she wheezed, clutching his arm. "Please, something's very wrong." As we rushed to the car, Patricia leaning heavily on Michael, while making appropriately distressed noises, one thought kept repeating in my mind: that coffee had been meant for me, which meant my loving daughter-in-law had just poisoned herself with her own murder weapon. How delightfully ironic. The emergency room was pure chaos, which seemed fitting for the situation. Patricia's condition had deteriorated during the car ride. More violent coughing, difficulty breathing, and an angry rash spreading across her neck like some kind of medieval plague. The medical team worked with impressive efficiency, hooking her up to monitors and asking questions none of us could answer without admitting to attempted murder. While Patricia was being examined and making quite the production of her suffering, Michael turned to me with worried eyes. "Mom, I'm going to my house to get her personal things. Pajamas, toothbrush. You know how hospitals are." "Of course, sweetheart," I said, patting his arm. How thoughtful of him to think of comfort items while his wife was potentially dying from mysterious poisoning. Such a caring husband. I settled into the waiting room, watching nurses hurry past and trying to process what had just happened. The magazines were all at least 2 years old, which gave me plenty of time to contemplate the fascinating turn my quiet Sunday had taken. 1 to 2 hours later, Michael returned with Patricia's overnight bag, looking appropriately exhausted and concerned. Almost immediately after his return, as if choreographed, Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the treatment area with the kind of grim expression doctors reserve for really bad news. "We found traces of a toxic substance in her bloodstream," he announced with clinical precision. "This appears to be deliberate poisoning." The word poisoning hung in the air like a death sentence, which technically it had been meant to be. Before I could fully process the irony of the situation, Patricia's voice rang out from behind the curtain, weak but remarkably clear for someone who'd been at death's door moments earlier. "She poisoned my coffee!" Patricia pointed directly at me with a shaking finger that seemed to have recovered quite nicely from her near-death experience. "Eleanor made me drink it." "Well, that was gratitude for you." Here I'd inadvertently saved her life by switching cups, and she was repaying the favor by trying to frame me for attempted murder. The younger generation really had no sense of irony. The police arrived within minutes, because apparently attempted murder gets priority response time. Detective Martinez took our statements separately, and I told them exactly what had happened. The strange smell, my instinct to switch the cups, Patricia drinking what was meant for me. The truth, basically, except for the part where I mentioned how satisfying it was to watch someone hoist on their own petard. Mrs. Wilson, Detective Martinez said carefully, if you suspected the coffee was dangerous, why didn't you just refuse to drink it? It was a fair question, though explaining that years of prosecuting criminals had given me a sixth sense about murder attempts seemed like it might raise more questions than it answered. I wasn't completely sure, I said, which was technically true. I just knew something smelled wrong. When Michael was questioned, his response cut deeper than any prosecutor's cross-examination. My mother's been acting strange lately, he said, not quite meeting my eyes while throwing me under the metaphorical bus. I mean, I don't think she'd hurt anyone, but the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. My own son, hedging his bets between his wife and his mother like he was placing odds at a racetrack. How absolutely charming. Mrs. Wilson, we need to verify some things at your house, Detective Martinez informed me later that evening. The way he said verify made it clear this wasn't really a request, more like a politely worded command performance. I accompanied them without suspicion, watching as they conducted what they called a routine search of my home. Routine, my foot. They were looking for evidence, and from their determined expressions, they expected to find it. 20 minutes later, they struck gold. Or rather, they found what someone had wanted them to find. A small bottle of clear liquid hidden in my bathroom cabinet, tucked behind the aspirin like some kind of deadly Easter egg. Along with it, a handwritten list that included Patricia's name and what appeared to be a receipt for chemical supplies. How convenient. How utterly, perfectly convenient. I've never seen any of this before, I said, staring at the evidence that had somehow materialized in my own bathroom. The handwriting on the list looked suspiciously like mine, which was either an impressive forgery or I'd developed a split personality with homicidal tendencies. The officers exchanged those meaningful glances that law enforcement officers perfect in training, the look that says, "We've got our suspect," without actually saying it out loud. "This is highly suspicious," one murmured to his partner, as if I couldn't hear them standing 3 feet away. "But we'll need computer analysis and expert testimony to build a solid case," the other replied, clearly having watched too many crime shows. "Ma'am, we'll be back tomorrow morning with a complete search warrant," Detective Martinez informed me, with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for people who are definitely going to jail. "We need to examine your computer and bring in forensic specialists." They left a patrol car stationed in front of my house, ostensibly for my protection, but clearly for surveillance. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the officer in the car pretending to read a newspaper while obviously watching my house, and realized that I was no longer a victim reporting a crime. I was a suspect under investigation for attempted murder. The evidence had been planted. Of that, I was absolutely certain. But how? And by whom? The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Someone had used those crucial hours at the hospital to set me up for attempted murder, and they'd done it with the kind of precision that suggested either professional experience or really excellent planning skills. As I drew the curtains closed, shutting out the sight of my police babysitter, I couldn't shake the feeling that my real troubles were just beginning. Whoever had orchestrated this little frame job was clearly more creative than your average criminal. How refreshing to finally meet someone who appreciated the finer points of evidence tampering. By morning, panic had set in with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. I could see the patrol car outside, looking about as subtle as a neon sign advertising "Suspected criminal lives here," and every fiber of my being screamed that I was about to be arrested for something I didn't do. Well, technically something I would have prevented if I'd been the intended victim, but let's not split hairs. I picked up my phone and dialed the one person I knew would believe me, mainly because he'd seen me in action for 20 years and knew I was far too smart to poison someone with my own coffee cups. "Frank, I need your help. I'm in a terrible situation," I said when my former colleague answered on the second ring. Frank Morrison had been my partner in the prosecutor's office for 2 decades. If anyone would recognize the difference between actual guilt and a really good frame job, it would be him. Plus, he owed me for covering for him during that unfortunate incident with the defense attorney and the hotel room, though we'd agreed never to speak of that again. "Frank, you've known me for 2 decades. You know I would never poison anyone." I paused. "Well, not anyone who didn't deserve it, and certainly not with such sloppy technique." "Of course I know that. Eleanor, tell me exactly what happened." I explained everything. The coffee, Patricia's theatrical poisoning, the conveniently planted evidence that had appeared in my bathroom like a malicious housewarming gift. They think I tried to murder my daughter-in-law. There's a police car watching my house like I'm some kind of criminal mastermind. Frank listened without interruption, which was one of his better qualities, then said he'd make some calls and get back to me. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again with the kind of urgency that suggested bad news. Eleanor, I just confirmed it through my contacts. They're issuing an arrest warrant first thing tomorrow morning. You need to get out of there now. How? There are police officers in front of my house playing the world's most obvious stakeout. Go out the back. Come to my city. You know my address. We'll figure this out together. Decades in law had taught me exactly how fugitives evade capture, which was knowledge I never thought I'd need to apply personally. Life has such an amusing sense of irony. I grabbed essential documents and what cash I had on hand, then slipped out through my back garden while the officers continued their surveillance of my front door. I drove to a train station 2 towns over, abandoned my car in long-term parking like some kind of suburban spy, and began a carefully planned journey involving multiple trains and buses. By evening, I was standing on Frank's doorstep, officially a fugitive from justice. Well, I said when he opened the door, this isn't exactly how I planned to spend my golden years, but at least it's more exciting than Bridge Club. Frank's guest room felt like a safe house, which in many ways, it was. The irony wasn't lost on me. After spending my life putting people in jail, I was now hiding from the very system I'd once served. Eleanor, you're officially a fugitive, he said over coffee the next morning, as if I needed reminding. This is serious. If they arrest me, I'll never be able to prove my innocence from inside a jail cell, I replied, stirring sugar into my coffee with perhaps more force than necessary. We need to find out who Patricia really is, because I'm fairly certain devoted daughter-in-law isn't her actual profession. Frank had maintained contacts throughout law enforcement during his retirement, the kind of network that comes from decades of Christmas cards and professional favors. While I couldn't show my face anywhere without risking arrest, he could make discreet inquiries without raising red flags or awkward questions about harboring fugitives. Let's start with basic background verification, Frank suggested, pulling out his laptop. Something about this whole situation feels orchestrated, like someone's been planning this for months. We spent the morning mapping out what we knew. Patricia had appeared in Michael's life 6 months ago, like some kind of romantic gift from the universe. They'd married within 3 months. And now someone had tried to poison me using her as the unwitting weapon. The timing was either remarkably coincidental or remarkably planned, and in my experience, criminals rarely relied on coincidence. Frank began making calls to contacts in various police departments, carefully framing his inquiries as routine consultation work. Meanwhile, I tried to piece together everything I knew about my daughter-in-law, which was surprisingly little for someone who'd been eating Sunday dinner at my table for 3 months. She claimed to be a nurse, but I'd never seen evidence of her work schedule or heard her mention colleagues. She said she was from California, but her accent had subtle inconsistencies that I'd dismissed as regional variation. Small details that I'd overlooked as unimportant now seemed potentially significant, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too polite to assemble. Eleanor, Frank said after his 3rd phone call, I'm going to run Patricia's name and details through some databases. If she's not who she claims to be, we'll find out. As we began our investigation, I couldn't help but think that somewhere out there, the real perpetrator was probably watching the news coverage of my case and congratulating themselves on executing the perfect crime. The kind of smugness that comes from successfully framing an innocent person must be particularly satisfying. Well, almost perfect. They'd underestimated one crucial factor. I was a prosecutor, not a victim, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a criminal conspiracy. Time to remind them why that distinction mattered. Frank's investigation yielded results faster than we'd expected, and they were more disturbing than even my cynical prosecutor's mind could have imagined. Apparently, my intuition about Patricia had been spot on, though I would have preferred to be wrong about having a serial killer in the family. Eleanor, your daughter-in-law doesn't exist, Frank announced, spreading documents across his kitchen table like he was laying out evidence for a grand jury. At least not as Patricia Peterson, but I found her operating under the name Victoria Blackwood in Phoenix, Arizona. The photographs were unmistakable. Same face, same practiced smile, same dead eyes that I'd mistaken for serenity. Victoria had been married to Harold Blackwood, a 72-year-old widower with substantial assets who'd probably thought he'd won the romantic lottery. Harold had died 8 months after their wedding, officially from complications related to food poisoning. How charmingly consistent. "There's more," Frank continued, pulling out another file with the enthusiasm of someone who'd struck investigative gold. "I found a second identity, Sarah Mills in Denver, Colorado. She was married to Robert Mills, 68, who died of sudden cardiac arrest 4 months after their wedding. The pattern was crystal clear. Patricia was a serial killer who specialized in marrying wealthy older men, then inheriting their money after conveniently timed deaths. She'd turned matrimonial murder into a business model, which was almost impressive in its efficiency. "Frank, something's bothering me about the timing," I said, studying the evidence and feeling that familiar prosecutor's itch that meant I was missing something important. "How did she manage to plant evidence in my house so quickly? She was in the hospital being treated for poisoning." "That's been nagging at me too," Frank admitted, leaning back in his chair. "Patricia was unconscious for most of that time, and even if she wasn't, she was under constant medical supervision. Someone else had to help her. But who would have access to my house during those exact hours?" Even as I asked the question, I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. Frank looked at me carefully, like a doctor preparing to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "Eleanor, only Michael had access to your house during that period, and if he didn't go where he said he went," I felt my stomach drop, like I'd been pushed off a cliff. "My son would never do that. He was shocked when Patricia got sick." But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into my own voice. "Sometimes the people we love surprise us," Frank said gently, though his expression suggested he was thinking the same dark thoughts I was trying to avoid. "I'm just saying the timing was very convenient." The doubt he was planting felt like poison itself, spreading through my thoughts and contaminating every memory of that day. Someone had planted that evidence with perfect timing and intimate knowledge of my home. The question was, had my son betrayed me, or was I just being paranoid? Given recent events, paranoia seemed like a perfectly reasonable response. Frank's words haunted me through a sleepless night, playing on repeat like some kind of emotional torture device. The next morning, I had a sudden realization that made my blood run cold and reminded me why I'd been a decent prosecutor. I noticed details that other people missed. "Frank, I just remembered something that might be important. A few days ago, I installed a security camera by my front door because of break-ins in the neighborhood. You have video footage of that day?" Frank's eyebrows shot up like he'd just realized we might have struck evidentiary gold. "With everything that's happened, I completely forgot about it." I grabbed my phone, pulling up the security app with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for lottery tickets. If Michael really went to his own house like he said, the camera won't show anything. But if he came to mine, my hands shook as I scrolled through the footage from the day we were at the hospital. Frank watched over my shoulder as I found the relevant time period, both of us holding our breath like we were defusing a bomb. There it was, clear as day and twice as damning. Michael's car pulling into my driveway at exactly the time he'd claimed to be at his own house. Michael walking to my front door with keys in his hand, moving with the kind of purposeful determination that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. Michael entering my house and staying inside for over an hour, more than enough time to plant evidence throughout the house and probably redecorate while he was at it. Worst of all, the footage showed him leaving through my back door, clearly attempting to avoid the front camera. Because nothing says innocent son running errands like sneaking out the back door of your mother's house. "He lied," I whispered, staring at the screen like it might suddenly show a different version of events. "My own son lied to the police about where he was." Frank put a hand on my shoulder with the kind of gentle sympathy usually reserved for funeral parlors. "Eleanor, I'm sorry, but now we have concrete evidence." I couldn't speak for several minutes. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged my vital organs. My son, the child I'd raised, supported through every failure and celebrated through every small success, had actively participated in framing me for attempted murder. "Why?" I finally managed, though the word came out as more of a croak. "Why would Michael do this?" "I don't know," Frank said quietly, "but we're going to find out." The sweet family dinners, the loving conversations, the concern in Michael's eyes at the hospital, it had all been an elaborate performance. My son was a stranger wearing a familiar face, and apparently he was much better at acting than I'd ever given him credit for. How delightfully twisted. I'd raised my own Judas, and he'd sold me out for significantly more than 30 pieces of silver. Despite Frank's protests and his very reasonable concerns about my mental health, I knew what I had to do. I'm going there, Frank. I need to confront my son with all the evidence. Eleanor, that's dangerous, Frank said, using the tone usually reserved for talking people off ledges. You're a fugitive, and now we know Michael can't be trusted. This could be a trap. I need to hear it from him before we go to the police, I replied, checking my car keys with the determination of someone who'd already made an irrevocable decision. I need to understand why my own son thought murdering his mother was a reasonable weekend activity. I drove to Michael's house that evening, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and heartbreak that felt like emotional whiplash. When I arrived, I could see lights on and hear voices inside, multiple voices, which meant Patricia was there too. Perfect. Nothing like a family reunion to really bring out everyone's true colors. I crept around to the side window and crouched down to listen, feeling like some kind of suburban spy. What I heard confirmed my worst fears and shattered what remained of my faith in both my parenting skills and my son's moral compass. Michael, stop feeling guilty about this. Patricia's voice was cold and calculating, like she was discussing weekend plans rather than attempted murder. Remember what we're doing this for. $7 million and a completely new life. I know, but seeing my mother like this, running from the police. Michael's voice was weak and conflicted, though not nearly conflicted enough for someone who'd just framed his mother for attempted murder. Your mother who treated you like a failure your entire life, who never believed in you. Patricia's manipulation was masterful, hitting every insecurity with surgical precision. With me, you're finally the man you were meant to be. I pulled out my phone and started recording, placing the camera carefully on the windowsill to capture both their faces. At least I'd have evidence of their little conspiracy, assuming I lived long enough to use it. You're right, Michael said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. She never respected me. At least with you, I feel like I matter. Suddenly, Patricia's eyes locked onto my phone like a predator spotting prey. Michael, your mother is here. Before I could move, Patricia had grabbed something from a drawer, a gun, because apparently my evening wasn't quite dramatic enough yet. Her voice carried clearly through the window, meant for me to hear. You just made this so much easier, Eleanor. Now I can claim self-defense when you came back to finish what you started. I dropped below the window line, my heart racing like I'd just sprinted a marathon. Patricia was planning to kill me right there and make it look like I'd returned to complete my attempted murder of her. Well, at least she was consistent in her creativity. Eleanor, I know you're out there. Patricia's voice carried through the night air as she moved through the house with the gun, sounding like some kind of demented game show host. Let's finish this once and for all. I crouched behind the garden shed, trying to control my breathing and wondering if this was how my career in law enforcement was going to end. Hiding behind garden tools while my daughter-in-law hunted me like a wild animal. The irony was almost poetic if you appreciated dark humor. Come out, wherever you are, Patricia called in a sing-song voice that would have been charming if it wasn't accompanying attempted murder. You can't hide forever, and frankly, I'm getting impatient. Through the open door, I could hear Michael's panicked voice. Patricia, this is getting way too dangerous. Maybe we should think about this. We should think about what? Patricia snapped back with the patience of someone who'd clearly reached her limit. She saw us. She heard everything. There's no going back now, Michael. We have to kill her for real this time. But what if someone hears the gunshot? The neighbors might call the police. Then we'll say she attacked me and I defended myself, Patricia replied with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she'd thought this through. The police already think she's a would-be murderer. This just makes their case easier. I had my phone clutched in my hand, still recording everything with the dedication of a war correspondent. Patricia's voice was clear, her intentions unmistakable, and her complete lack of remorse was frankly impressive in its thoroughness. She was planning my death and explaining exactly how she'd cover it up, like she was giving a lecture on advanced murder techniques. Michael, help me search the yard, Patricia commanded with the authority of someone who was clearly in charge of this particular criminal enterprise. She can't have gone far, and I'd like to wrap this up before the late news starts. I heard footsteps on the patio, then moving in my general direction with the kind of systematic approach that suggested they'd watched too many detective shows. My only chance was to stay low and hope they'd search the other side of the yard first, giving me time to plan my escape. This is completely insane, Michael muttered, but I could hear him following Patricia's orders anyway, because apparently attempted matricide was where he drew the line at independent thinking. Insane is letting a 70-year-old woman ruin our perfect plan, Patricia replied coldly. We've come too far to let her destroy everything now. Besides, Think of it as early inheritance. As they moved to the far corner of the yard, I saw my opportunity. Staying low and moving with the kind of stealth I'd never needed before, I crept toward the gate and slipped out into the alley behind the house. I ran to my car with more speed than I'd shown since high school track, hands shaking as I started the engine. I had everything I needed now. Video evidence of Michael planting evidence, audio recordings of their conspiracy, and Patricia's direct threats to kill me. Time to end this nightmare once and for all, assuming I could survive long enough to see justice served. I drove straight to Frank's house, my hands still trembling from adrenaline and the surreal experience of being hunted by my own family. "Frank, I have everything. Patricia tried to kill me, and I got it all on recording." Frank took one look at my face and immediately put on coffee, because apparently surviving attempted murder called for caffeine. We spent the next hour reviewing the evidence, the security camera footage of Michael, the audio recordings of their conspiracy, and Patricia's remarkably clear threats against my life. It was more than enough to prove my innocence and expose their guilt, assuming the justice system still functioned the way it was supposed to. "Eleanor, this is solid evidence of conspiracy, attempted murder, and witness intimidation," Frank said, reviewing the recordings with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades building cases. "We need to get this to the authorities immediately. Plus identity fraud, murder, and probably tax evasion," I added, "because if you're going to build a case, you might as well be thorough about it." Patricia's been quite the busy little criminal. We drove to the state police headquarters, where Frank's contacts ensured we got an immediate hearing with detectives instead of sitting in waiting rooms until next Tuesday. I surrendered myself while simultaneously presenting all the evidence we'd gathered, which was probably the most dramatic entrance that building had seen in years. "Mrs. Wilson," Detective Captain Rodriguez said, after reviewing everything with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for lottery numbers, "this completely changes the investigation. We're issuing arrest warrants for both Patricia Peterson and your son Michael immediately." "There's more you need to know," I said, showing them Frank's research on Patricia's previous identities and marriages. "She's a serial killer who's done this before. Multiple times, actually. She's very thorough." Within hours, police teams were dispatched to arrest both Patricia and Michael. I waited at the station, finally feeling like justice might prevail, assuming Patricia didn't have another escape plan tucked away somewhere. Given her track record, assuming anything seemed optimistic. The call came an hour later. "We have Michael in custody, but Patricia escaped." The house was empty, except for Michael, who was sitting in the living room like he was waiting for us. From wherever she was hiding, and knowing Patricia, she probably had multiple backup plans. She made one final play that demonstrated exactly why she'd been so successful at this whole serial killing business. She called the police tip line with a story designed to save herself and destroy Michael. "This is Patricia Peterson," she told the detective with the kind of tearful sincerity that would have won awards. "I want to report that everything was Michael Wilson's idea. He forced me to help him poison his mother. I have text messages proving he planned everything." Even facing arrest, Patricia was playing the game like a chess grandmaster, throwing Michael under the bus with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly thought this through. You had to admire her commitment to self-preservation. "She's lying," Michael screamed when they told him about Patricia's call, finally showing some emotion beyond guilty anxiety. "It was all her idea. She manipulated me into everything." But by then, Patricia had vanished into the wind, leaving Michael to face the consequences alone while she probably planned her next identity and victim. The manhunt for Patricia lasted 6 days, which was apparently longer than it takes to find most fugitives, but shorter than it takes to plan a decent wedding. Despite her head start and what I assumed were considerable resources, modern surveillance technology and her unfortunate habit of targeting predictable demographics caught up with her eventually. Police found her at a hotel 3 states away, already researching her next potential victim, another wealthy widower she'd met online, because apparently she had a type and wasn't shy about pursuing it. The man was probably thinking he'd won the romantic lottery, poor fool. Meanwhile, Michael sat in jail, abandoned by his partner in crime and facing the full weight of the law he'd helped circumvent. When Patricia was finally brought back in handcuffs, the reunion was not what either of them had planned for their criminal partnership. "You lying bitch," Michael screamed at Patricia as she was led past his cell, finally showing the kind of passion I'd hoped he might have demonstrated in defending his mother. "You promised we'd be together." Patricia looked at him with cold amusement, like she was observing an interesting but ultimately disappointing science experiment. Oh, Michael, you sweet, stupid man. Did you really think this was about love? The trial was a spectacular display of mutual destruction that would have been entertaining if it hadn't involved my own family. Patricia maintained her story that Michael had forced her participation through threats and manipulation, while Michael insisted Patricia had been the mastermind who'd seduced him into betraying his own mother. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said with the kind of dramatic flair I'd once admired, "we have two criminals who conspired to murder an innocent woman, and now they can't even honor their criminal partnership." Patricia's past came back to haunt her in devastating detail. The families of Harold Blackwood and Robert Mills testified about their suspicions. Investigators presented evidence of her pattern of identity fraud, and the timeline of deaths following her marriages painted a clear picture of serial murder with impressive efficiency. "Mrs. Peterson," the judge said at sentencing, "you are a predator who has spent years targeting vulnerable people for their money. This court sentences you to life in prison without possibility of parole." Michael received 20 years for conspiracy and evidence tampering, a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation in revealing Patricia's methods, and probably his genuine remorse, though that was debatable. As I sat in the courtroom watching them both be led away in shackles, I felt a complex mixture of justice and sorrow. Patricia would spend the rest of her life in prison, which seemed appropriate for someone who'd made a career of murder. Michael would lose the best years of his remaining life paying for his betrayal, which was tragic but necessary. "The most fitting punishment," I told Frank afterward, "is that they'll spend their prison years knowing exactly how much they hate each other." I was free, vindicated, and alive, but the cost was the destruction of my family and the knowledge that my own son had been willing to watch me die for money. Sometimes the price of survival is everything you thought you were fighting to protect. But at least I'd gotten the last laugh, and really, isn't that what family is all about? Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.